I'm Mary Carmichael. I'm the Executive Director of the Public Charter School Alliance of South Carolina, and my partner in crime here.
I'm Mary's assistant.
We're all Mary's assistant.
You do this?
With magnets, yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Here.
You want to drive?
Yeah.
All right, Mary's going to let me drive, which is not a good thing, as my wife will attest to in the room. So we wanted to touch on today about several options that already exist and just kind of remind legislators about these options, how they interact, how they work within the funding formula, and just to kind of give you a refresher course, if you will. So magnet schools exist throughout the state in many different forms. They can be career and technology, like your career centers, which many of you have. Those are kind of a form of a magnet school. If you're from Charleston, Mr. Whipper, we know about Charleston Academic Magnet School and the Charleston School for the Arts and other ones down that way. There is not a definition, though, in state law for a magnet school. I'm not proposing that there needs to be one. Just want to make a point out to legislators that there actually isn't a definition. But there is one from the Magnet Schools of America, which you can see up there on the screen as well. And so something to keep in mind going forward. So how are magnets funded? Well, magnets are funded just like any other public school. Local, state, federal funds. They do stop at the district level. So districts do have discretion of how they want to fund magnets, what type of magnet programs they want to offer, and what parental demand is. So sometimes you might have a magnet program that's within a school. So in Richland 2 at Wright Middle School, there's a law magnet program within that middle school. So it's not a whole school program. So how are they held accountable? A pretty simple answer. Just like other traditional schools, they get state and federal report card requirements. Their teachers are evaluated by the state system. And of course, they learn state standards and are held measured by state assessments. So some policies to consider around magnet programs as y'all think about the structure and governance and funding for South Carolina. EFA and state categorical funds really don't differentiate between magnets and traditional schools. And I would submit to you that's a good thing. You're looking at funding students as opposed to funding a program. When you start funding programs, you change the incentives, as we've heard today. And you might see a whole bunch of programs spring up. So STEM is a great thing. A lot of STEM work being done out there. But if the state were to go and say, we're going to give you an extra 50% per pupil for STEM programs, you'll have STEM programs all over the place and probably no art programs that are in the magnet schools. Again, we don't think that's a good idea. We think it's better to fund the student and let local folks decide what type of programs to offer. EFA, again, flows, and EI flows to the district first, then to the schools, as Oren's represented a couple times here now. That determines what magnet programs will be in place. Some school districts are very responsive to their parents and to their constituents. Some are not, and that's just something to keep in mind. And finally, I'll just talk about a little bit about magnet admission and enrollment processes, because sometimes magnets and public charter schools are confused a little bit. Magnet programs do have sometimes selective processes. There might be an application process, might have to write an essay, teacher or guidance counselor recommendation, potentially even test scores. So that is a little bit different than public charter schools, which are what we call open enrollment. They're open to any child so long as there's space available, and if there's excess demand and not enough supply, then a lottery is held. So that's just something to keep in mind. Again, that's not a judgment call whether that's a bad or a good thing. It's just an acknowledgement that magnet schools do have and can have sometimes some admission requirements that other public schools, like public charter schools, are not permitted to have. And the final thing are about efficacy. Efficacy is a big word in education. How are we making a difference in these children's lives in magnet programs? Magnet schools sometimes get a state report card if they're a standalone school like Charleston Academic Magnet, but there are these magnet programs that are sometimes called schools within schools that we actually don't have any data on how those students are performing. We don't know how they are because they're kind of traced back to their home school, their school they might be zoned for. So that's just something to consider when you look at efficacy, how you measure that. And Mary's going to talk quite a bit about public charter schools.
I'll pass them down this side. I've got some frequently asked questions, Mythbuster sheet there. I always get questions from legislators. I'm sorry, Representative Govan's not in the room. He always asks me the most in-depth questions about things. So we do have a state definition, unlike the magnet schools, of what a charter school is. It's a fairly technical, in the weeds kind of answer to it all. It's actually, the federal definition is actually a little more abstract and creative, which is kind of ironic. I did want to make sure that we understood that charter schools in South Carolina are nonprofit corporations. There are no for-profit charter schools in the state of South Carolina, nor are there in really any state that we know of. We think there are some places that do allow the districts to contract with some for-profit entities, and that, in fact, I think has happened actually in South Carolina in some districts in the past even. The schools are autonomous and are sponsored by a local school district, the South Carolina Public Charter School District, or a sponsoring institute of higher education. That higher education piece was actually approved and put into law in 2012 in the charter school bill that we passed that year. This is the first year, this coming fiscal year, that we'll actually have a school sponsored by higher ed. I was honored to do their board training last night. It is a school with SC State. I understand it was a very heated discussion yesterday with SC State downstairs. Upstairs at the same time, I did have Felton Lab School with me in Ways and Means, and they were there to help answer any questions. We're trying to make sure that that school has full autonomy, though it will still be sponsored by the university. And we're excited to make sure that that school is successful. And it's an A-rated school as it is. It is a public school and it's under the special school category now, and they're becoming a public charter school, and we think that they'll actually have more autonomy, more control over where your state dollars are going, actually, which we're excited about. And then we are exempt, unless it's otherwise mentioned in the Charter School Act, from all provisions of the law and regulations applicable to a public charter school board or a district, although a charter school may elect to comply with one or more of these provisions of the law or regulations. So while we've got a lot of flexibility, unfortunately, because of some of the categorical funds that Orrin mentioned, there are many things that my charter schools do end up opting into and kind of tying their hands, only because otherwise they'd be leaving a lot of money on the table. I'm happy to discuss that offline with you sometime. So who's sponsoring charters? I think there's a perception out there right now that all the schools are with the statewide district. That's not the case. There are 35 currently sponsored in 16 local districts around the state. There are 31 sponsored by the South Carolina Public Charter School District, and then the first one will open with a higher ed authorizer this next year. The Alliance, we're not an authorizer, neither is the Department of Education. There's always some confusion that the Department of Education is the statewide district. That's not the case either. We were very clear when we wrote that law many years ago, I guess 7 or 8 years ago now, that was a standalone entity, and I think Elliott and others that are working on these transformation districts, achievement districts around the country, they've been very clear to say that it shouldn't be the state board that is overseeing that transformation district, and I'm sure Mike Brennan would be happy if we advocate for that. No more responsibilities for him, since he's the incoming state board chair probably. And so the framework for success for a charter school, I think it gets confusing sometimes, and actually Emily's gone now, but Emily and I had a conversation yesterday just about how a charter school is sponsored and what that relationship is, and understanding that the charter school does have autonomy from that sponsoring district. They are a separate 501c3 entity. Their governing board oversees and does the oversight of making sure that charter gets implemented with the fidelity that was written in. The charter sponsor then makes sure that they're being in compliance with all state and federal laws and doing what they said they were going to do in the charter. And then in South Carolina, the Department of Education actually does not have a lot of teeth to force a sponsoring district to close a school if the school isn't doing what they said they were going to do. And so the law that we passed last year, that you all passed, and we appreciate that, does take into account that if a school's failing for 3 or more years in a row, they would automatically close. And we really appreciate you guys working on that with us, because we've had some schools, some of them in your districts, that because of politics and other things, we just know those local authorizer districts are never going to close those schools on their own, unfortunately. So it's pretty steady growth. We wanted you to see that. Some would think that when the state charter school district opened, it just kind of took off, but it didn't. It's been fairly steady growth since we started having schools in 1998. This is where all the charter schools are, and then that's where all the virtual schools actually cover the entire state. So we want to make sure that you understand that while I've got brick and mortar schools all over, then even in those gaps where there are no public charter schools physically yet, the virtual schools are serving students in, I think, every legislative area at this point. So how are schools funded? There's actually 4 different funding models that we have to keep up with, and I try to keep all of those ducklings in a row and not coming to you separately and trying to advocate for their special need, but keeping everybody trying to working together for the students of South Carolina. So they're the locally sponsored schools, and we'll talk a little bit about how that funding works in another slide. And then there's the conversion schools, and that a few years ago, the language got even muddier on that, and our friends in Williamsburg County they're the first conversion since the law changed. It's going to be an interesting couple of years to try to implement how this language got put in there in 2012 and what that's going to define, but it kind of goes back to they now don't truly, a conversion school in a local district right now that's new will not really follow under a funding formula. It will be up to the district and the school to decide how they're going to fund that school. And I can tell you offline over cocktails how that happens sometime. There might be a bridge named after somebody in Charleston, though, that helped write it. And then the public charter school district, we are all very familiar with how that funding works. There's no local effort there, and we'll look at that in a moment. We do the way that it's written right now. Unfortunately, there are several lobbyists that have some job security because we do have to come back to you every year and ask you to fund that. There is no actual funding formula that kicks in. There's a line item there, and we have to come back and make sure that the student growth for that district is covered each year. And then you've got the higher ed institutions in that as well. You've also got then facility funding right now and how that works. We did a study that I've got some copies of a few years, last November we did, and it's got findings of what the current status was at that point and then some recommendations. There's no recurring state funding for facilities. Last year we did get a revolving loan fund finally funded. It was set up in 2012 but never funded. The governor's budget and the House budget was very generous and had $4 million in it. By the time our senators were done with it, it was down to $500,000, so unfortunately. So we appreciate anything, but it was cut significantly. So we hope that we'll see some more money in there this year. And then the average charter school right now is spending about $600 per pupil on facilities out of their education dollars. So that's money that you've allocated for classroom that the charter schools are forced to use to pay for the actual classroom itself and the facilities. Transportation, charters and magnets are not guaranteed transportation by the state-owned school bus fleet. South Carolina is very unique in the way that we fund school bus transportation anyways. But if we are going to say that we're a choice state, we should at least be funding the transportation to magnet schools and charter schools. I know in Berkeley County and some of the other districts, there are no buses at all, and it's completely up to the parents for the magnet schools. Most of the charter schools are that way. And the districts are typically not providing that. It's up to the schools. So I've got schools spending $130,000, $180,000 out of their classroom educational dollars to make sure that a diverse student population can get to their school. Providing transportation equals increased access to the schools of choice for those underserved communities. And we see the schools that are taking that money and providing transportation are far more diverse schools because of that, and we want integrated schools. Operational funding, there's wide disparity exists. There's a range of about 41% statewide in some of that funding. And then I've got a slide that's going to show this, I think. Yeah. I know this is small. So the base student funding, as you know, just got cut a little bit this last month in the checks that went out to the districts and to the charter schools. The statewide district has that base funding, and then there's that additional line item that creates sustainable funding for the district. The first 2 years, those schools operated on $1,700 a kid base student funding. I honestly don't know how any of them existed through that. A couple of them, I think, probably still have debt they incurred at that time that they're trying to pay off. So this year, it's $3,600 per student that's in there, and then it gets weighted out in the fashion that Orrin explained. So they're at about $5,700 a kid right now. For my local districts, the way that revenue stream works is they take the State Department of Education helps us take the audited revenues of the general operating budgets for the school district from the previous fiscal year and divides it by the total number of students that they had. And right now the average is about $5,800. So we're not, the statewide district, when you look at just education dollars and that base student funding, is really not that far off when you look at brick and mortar. The gap is then, though, when we look at the virtual schools, that sustainability line item is only at $1,900, and so that's bringing them to about $4,000 per pupil. We would rather see equitable funding for all of the students in the statewide district and then additional facilities money and things like that. The difference in that's been justified because of the virtual schools not having to pay for facilities, but we don't think that any of the public charter schools should be paying for the facilities out of their education dollars anyways. And I think there's good evidence to show that the virtual schools could do much more and probably introduce some other blended learning components and increase their effectiveness as well if they had equitable funding. The increase this current fiscal year is about $12 million for the statewide district. I think it will be somewhere, I think the statewide district's asking about $14 million. Felton Lab School will be about $1.5 million, I think, in the budget this year, if it's funded altogether. And so we know that we're continually coming back to you to ask for that funding, and that's concerning to us. And we hope that we can come up with a way to fund students in the state and not fund it. We know that there may be a threshold eventually that we cross that's just going to, as those line items get bigger and bigger, and we are concerned. And then we want to talk a little bit about how we are holding charter schools accountable, and the law that got passed in 2014 certainly helps with that. Students do learn the state standards, they take state assessments, they receive the same federal letter ratings and school report cards as all of the schools. The charter schools that receive those lowest federal accountability ratings for 3 years automatically close, like I mentioned. And then a charter school must be revoked or not renewed by the sponsor if it's determined that the school failed to maintain its books and records according to generally accepted accounting principles or failed to create an appropriate system of internal control. And I don't think the number, the one about the automatic closure and the accounting one doesn't necessarily apply to all public schools, but just charter schools. And I think I've got a few charter schools that would like to see that applied across the board too. If we're going to be held accountable for the same things, then maybe others should too. And some policy implications, solving the operations funding issue. We really want to figure out together the disparity, not just in the charter school world, but also across the state. We see such disparity between the coastal states and some of the inland states, and even within districts sometimes. So trying to figure out what that looks like in the future together is important. We want to be part of that solution. And then solving the facilities and transportation issues. And again, that's not just a charter school issue. We see facilities issues across the state too, in some of the districts that just don't have the tax base to be able to support a $500 million bond in those things. And transportation issues would like to see covered for both the charter schools and the magnet schools in the future. And then new state mandates with the computer-based testing, things like that. There's new costs that are being incurred. A lot of the local districts are rolling in their technology funding into 20-year bonds, 15-year bonds that we're now financing at the local level, iPads and laptops that will be obsolete in 2 and 3 years, but we'll still be paying on them 15 years from now. We don't think that's the solution for technology funding in the state, but at the same time, the charter schools are being left behind because we can't issue bonds like that either. And so we really struggle to figure out how we're going to fund technology, and we appreciate the new technology money that was in the budget last year, but when that really boils down to $35 or $40 a kid on average, that really didn't go as far as we need to really fund what that needs to look like. Other ways that facilities funding is being done in states across the country, better access to vacant or underutilized facilities for free of charge instead of right now our law says at market rate. And that market rate, I can assure you the school districts get very creative on trying to figure out what market rate means. A-rated office space in downtown Charleston is usually not what a vacant building should be equivalent to. Incentives or requirements to be included in the local district bonds. Colorado and some other states have been very successful in trying to figure out how to incentivize local districts to include charter schools in that. And it does help pass some of those bonds because you've got voters in charter schools that want to see that happen. And Charleston County and a couple other districts have been kind and have done that in the past, but there's nothing that would require or incentivize them to do so. And then direct per pupil facility funding, several states have done that as well, and that would be a per pupil amount. The average that schools are paying right now is $600 per pupil for those facilities, so somewhere between 0 and 600 would be appreciated at any time in the future. And then well-funded revolving loan funds would certainly increase the access to capital. Those schools in the first 3 years or so, and my friend Mike Brennan in the back can attest that they struggle dearly to try to find any financing those first few years before they really have any credit history. And I will turn it back over to Jay.
Thank you, Mary. Great job as always on behalf of all the children in public charter schools. I'm going to talk a little bit about virtual schools and programs here in South Carolina. And there's a couple different ways you can see this appear. So there are whole schools. These are typically virtual charter schools authorized by the statewide public charter school district. Theoretically, you could have a school district have a virtual school as well, but it depends on whether they're going to give it its own, what's called a school ID, which means it would give its own report card, or whether it's actually more of a program that's just housed in perhaps one location, or perhaps serves just one segment of the student body. They can be full-time, of course, where students take all their courses online. You also have what's sometimes called part-time or supplemental online learning that exists in many states and exists in South Carolina. One is Virtual SC, which is the state-supported program run by the State Department of Education that is free, no cost to public, private, and homeschool students. I would tell you that's not the case in every state that has a state-run virtual program. In North Carolina, for example, it's only available to public school students, even though homeschool students pay taxes and they're not having access to this program. So Virtual SC was set up in a model that's open to everyone, but it is only paid for by the state. There is no local cost sharing involved. There's no kind of skin in the game, as Chairman Leatherman would say, at the local level. Districts in South Carolina do have the ability to start their own supplemental programs. They can contract with any type of provider, for-profit, nonprofit, college, university, whatever it might be, to satisfy their needs. So that's another option that's available. So how are they funded? So this is where we get some differences in the model as opposed to funding students. So virtual charter schools, as Mary has articulated very well, they're funded in a state line budget items through the EFA, just like other students, but then they have this supplement that's supposed to make up for some amount of local money that the students are generating but not receiving. Virtual SC is funded totally by an appropriation to the State Department of Education, approximately $2.9 million. And it does have the ability to generate some of its own revenue from school district agreements. Some school districts are piloting a program whereby they will use their own teachers. Mr. Wells, Aiken County is doing this, by the way. They'll use Aiken County teachers, but use Virtual SC courses, and they're licensed to the school district to use. And so that's a new thing Virtual SC is doing. And then there's school district programs that folks may have. I know Beaufort County has one, Greenville has one, Horry County has one. But these virtual programs aren't really reported back to the State Department of Ed. We may know they exist per se, but we actually don't have a way to track it. And so those students are, say, in the Horry County virtual program, but they're actually enrolled at Socastee High School. So all we know them as are a Socastee High School student. They actually may not be physically setting foot on Socastee High School campus ever, but they are going to get the total funding as if they were a brick and mortar student. Whereas their neighbor who goes to a virtual charter school is going to get about 41% of what that student's getting. So that's the disparity that exists in some areas of virtual education in the state. Two students, both going to full-time online schools. One is getting kind of full funding or funding every other student would get, and another one, because they're in a virtual charter school, will get about 41%. Accountability. So different levels of accountability. Just like brick and mortar public charter schools, virtual charter schools take state assessments, they teach state standards, they get a state report card, and of course they're subject to automatic closure. And there actually was a virtual charter school closed this past year for poor performance in the state. Virtual SC, same thing for the most part. They do state standards, they do state assessments. They do have a little flexibility on certification. The State Department of Ed can actually hire almost anyone to teach in this program without necessarily having state certification if they feel the need to do that. There is an annual report that does talk a lot about performance of Virtual SC, and I will say that their performance is very good. It's a very good state-run supplemental program. but they don't get a state report card, and it's not something that's frankly kind of reviewed on an annual basis by the State Department of Ed. And the state board does get an annual report as well. Mr. Brennan knows about that, but again, it's not to the degree that a virtual charter school will have. And again, on district programs, they're teaching state standards and state assessments, but the student's performance is oftentimes traced back to the school of record. So again, I'm enrolled in the Horry County virtual program, let's say, and I'm zoned for Socastee High School. My test results will go on Socastee High School's report card, not on the Horry County virtual program. So you can't ever really judge the efficacy of that virtual program. It also comes to pass that sometimes school districts want to work with providers for their virtual programs, and they can't get state certification for all those teachers because a lot of hoops to go through, costs are involved, and so what they will do, they will assign students to a Horry County teacher called a teacher of record, but the actual instruction is delivered by that virtual school provider teacher. We would like to solve that because that really isn't a transparent way to operate, and we'd like school districts to be able to use whomever they want. And so we hope to work with the State Department over the next couple of years to still hold good standards for certification and licensure, but provide flexibility to school districts and other types of public charter schools. So some policy implications, and there's a lot of them up here. Again, I'll stress again that fund students, not specific programs. There is a disparity that exists between what we would call a district-operated full-time virtual program and full-time virtual charter schools, and we would suggest to you there shouldn't be a disparity, that those students should be funded the same. Let the money follow the child. Local school district, obviously, they're going to respond to demands for virtual education. That's one thing that's great about course choice. With course choice, you empower the parents and the children to say, I want to take 4 courses at my local high school and 2 through this course choice program. And so you really empower parents. Right now, if the local school district doesn't necessarily want to offer a virtual program, they don't have to. And while students can't be restricted to go to virtual SC does have a finite budget, and it does have a finite number of teachers. And so it doesn't necessarily always have the capacity to meet the demand that exists out there. And that's oftentimes in the annual reports. They had X number of enrollments, but they could have served X more if they had the funds available. And a course choice program might be one way to resolve that issue. Again, efficacy of virtual programs. We know virtual charter schools have efficacy because they have state report cards, state test results, et cetera. Some of the district programs do not. Cost sharing. John didn't mention necessarily about course choice, but in Louisiana, part of the costs are borne by the local school district when that student chooses that course. Because obviously that school district is not educating the child for that particular course. So that's an opportunity for cost sharing, so the state is not 100% on the hook. Right now for virtual SC, again, the state funds it 100% out of its way. It's really, frankly, a free intervention for school districts to use. And finally, quality standards for virtual SC and providers. The state of Florida has instituted a number of good quality standards through partnerships with like INACOL. INACOL is the International Association of K-12 Online Learning. They have a set of quality standards, not just on content, but a growing area is accessibility for students with disabilities. There's a whole set of standards coming down the pike on how you make virtual and online learning accessible to students with disabilities. Many providers are already on that track and have already made those courses accessible. Some of the state-run supplemental programs that exist in different states haven't even thought about it yet. And that's going to be an interesting challenge because I can tell you as a person that works in this realm, making courses accessible for all students with disabilities is expensive. And if standards are going to be held for providers to do that, everyone needs to be playing by the same game. And there's a lot of school districts that don't realize this is coming down the pike. So a couple of closing thoughts on public schools choice, and Mary, you can come back in and jump in. I think what you've heard from our perspective is to fund the students, not specific models that are out there. Let's continue to put things into that primary funding formula, let that money backpack and follow the child. Student-centered funding with allows for more local control and more innovation. Again, if you had a funding formula that said we're going to give 50% more to STEM students, you'll get nothing but STEM schools. You won't get arts, you won't get career and technology, you won't get international baccalaureate or AP or foreign language or international language-based ones. And finally, efficacy. I think you've heard everyone talk about performance, outcomes, efficacy, being able to measure efficacy for all these models requires really good student data systems that are secure and protect student privacy, but also allow public, the researchers, providers, and partners with school districts access to de-identified student data so they can see how is this online course serving students who are 2 grade levels behind and are eligible for free and reduced lunch, that kind of data points. So with that, we will stop and take any questions.
Anything?
Question in the back, Elliot.
Yeah, I was just going to say, one of the things that Tennessee was smart about, I take no credit, I wasn't yet there, but they really looked at local examples of success, charters that could turn around neighborhood schools. Are there a few schools that you could just highlight or point to that you're really proud of in terms of results in the state?
That are turnaround? I don't know that South Carolina is.
That serve a diverse population of kids and are doing a great job, or some just real high flyers?
Yeah, so Charleston Math and Science is actually probably serving the most diverse student population in the state, and and you were actually there in the beginning of that, I think. You weren't necessarily a charter fan then either, I think I remember. You're just being paid not to be. Elliot and I have lots of emails going back years, I think. They, by design from the beginning, that school wanted to have a diverse school, and that's one of the schools that does take money out of their classroom dollars to make sure they provide transportation. And they take kids in that are 3 and 4 years behind in math fluency and trying to figure out how to close those achievement gaps so that they are able to take calculus by the time they finish high school. When you have kids that have never memorized multiplication, division, addition, subtraction, they cannot do pre-algebra work in 6th and 7th grade. It would take them 8 hours to do the homework that it would take a kid 30 minutes to do.
Yeah, I would say to Elliot's point about turnarounds, the State Department of Ed has had for many years a school improvement grant, a very large school improvement grant that's existed, and yet it has never used what I would call the turnaround model. It uses the transformation model, where they simply kind of bring in extra consultants and bring in extra staff and try to work within that system. There has always been the ability for the lowest performing schools to use this federal grant program, which every state gets, to do a turnaround model and to bring in an operator, and just no one has chosen to go that route. I will say one thing about high performing charter schools. If you look at 3 in Greenville County, Greenville Tech Charter High School, Greer Middle College, and Brazier Early College Campus, these are 3 95% and higher graduation rate, among the highest SAT and ACT score. They always have lottery kind of schools. And yet, because of that antiquated local district funding formula, they are not funded anywhere near, I hate to say it, what Charleston Math and Science would be, or what Riverview Academy in Beaufort County would get. And that's one of the problems with the current charter funding model, is that there's really 4 formulas, and the local district ones, oftentimes it's what you ask for, will you get it? I mean, I can tell you lots of stories where Brazier Middle College Campus and others have found out after the fact they aren't getting the same amount of funding that another school is because they didn't ask for it. Well, they didn't even know it existed. So that's another reason why we think the models that exist for charters need to be at least simplified and try to get to one model so that we just have backpack funding, money follows the child to the public school of their choice.
The new funding formulas, we understand what the focus and the priorities were, but on the micro level at the school level, and Representative Bedingfield and others are well aware of this, it really, those 3 schools in particular all lost between $250,000 and $350,000 when we put in those new funding formulas, mainly just because they are high schools, and those high school kids were all weighted, and we didn't really get into the weighting system in detail, but they were all weighted as a 1.25 up until this year. They all went to a 1, and then you put on those different add-on weightings. If you're already a school that's got high achievement, you're not going to get the academic achievement money. You're not going to get some of those things. So it really hit about 1/3 of our charter schools actually lost money with the new funding formula.